Before this video actually starts, I want to thank my Patreon patricians, without whose help this video would have never been able to be done. And I also want to dedicate this video to two Russian friends living here in Argentina, whose stories have also inspired me to talk about all their suffering back in Russia. Have you ever heard of Quadrobers? No, they're not quite furries, and they're not therians either, but in Russia, they've become the center of a growing controversy. Quadrobers are a young subculture where people wear animal-like gear, sometimes masks, paws, or even full fursuits. Not necessarily because they feel spiritually connected to an animal like therians do, but because they enjoy the physical expression that comes with it.
Сегодня все чаще можно встретить детей на улице, имитирующих повадки животных. Они бегают на четвереньках, лают и рычат. Сами себя подростки называют квадроберы.
It's a trend that's been gaining popularity among teens, especially online. It all started from a Japanese runner called Kenichi Ito, who developed quadrobics and competes in Tokyo.
It is a bizarre warm-up method, but Kenichi Ito is a pioneer.
It's interesting how this has caught on in Russia rather than in other places of the world, given Russia's weak connection with the rest of the world. But now, this has moved on to the streets, with kids and teens conquering the physical world, having fun, pretending they are animals. It is quite confusing for Western like me to tell the difference, since some furries might like this exercise, but they might not necessarily be involved in this trend. It could be pretty much like furries are down here in Argentina, going to parks, attending meetups, and having crowds look at them and take pictures. However, and surprising to no one, not everyone is happy about it.
Квадроберы ходят в масках и с хвостами. Субкультурой фури их объединяет только то, что оба движения используют анималистическую атрибутику.
Since late 2023 and throughout 2024, Russian media has been pushing a narrative against quadrobers, claiming they could represent a threat to traditional values, and even suggesting that this is part of a Western attempt to corrupt Russian youth. What started as online criticism soon escalated into a full-blown political debate, with the Russian parliament stepping in to denounce this trend. But why? Why would the government care so much about teenagers dressing up as animals? Is this really about protecting values, or is there something bigger going on? How's it going, everyone? This is Slightly the Fox. In this video, we're going to break it all down. The media backlash, the government's response, and why some believe this entire controversy is just a distraction from Russia's real problems. The first sign of trouble came from traditional Russian media. Around October 2024, news outlets began running stories about young people dressing in animal-like costumes, presenting it as something strange, suspicious, and even dangerous. Instead of treating it as just another harmless fashion trend or online subculture, they framed it as a moral issue, a sign that young people were being led astray by foreign influences. The common thread around it was, you guessed it, queer culture stepping in the middle.
Quadrobing is associated with the LGBTQ community and zoophobia. At least that is the conclusion of a propagandist and film director, Nikita Mikhalkov.
However, while it is true that there are LGBTQ+ people in the furry community, this subculture is primarily about creativity and self-expression, not sexual orientation. According to some Russian YouTubers I had the chance to watch, this activity is mainly physical and popular because it helps the young as a method of escapism. If this sounds familiar, it's because this isn't the first time Russia and traditional conservationists in general have gone after youth subcultures. In the past, movements like the punk, goth, and even the emo community were demonized as threats to Russian values and the promotion of destructive behavior. The same is happening now with quadrobers. And what is the main fear, you might be wondering? Is it really that young people are being influenced by the Western culture? I don't think this is the main point. What really lies underneath this freak show is that the Soviet man manufactured by constant propaganda, who was ready for war and dying for the motherland, is not existent anymore. In fact, this escapism I mentioned before is key here, since we, and I include myself here, view the furry fandom as a way to add some color to a life that has mainly lost a bit of its spark. We need to understand that this is just a way out, and since times have changed, so have the generations of whom these old people tend to be afraid. Russian media often tends to portray anything different or unconventional as part of a behavior that could undermine traditional culture. Dressing up in animal gear is apparently too Western, too different, and therefore too dangerous. Yet, is this really the media trying to coin an opinion? Or is it just what the traditional Russian TV consumer wants to hear? Traditions are something we all tend to construct, and the new always pushes its way through violently. That is to say, facing resistance. But media outrage wasn't enough. Soon, the government got involved, and this is when things got a little interesting. At first, this controversy was just another moral panic in the media, but when politicians started talking about it, things escalated quickly. The Russian parliament and other officials began to push the idea that Quadrobers weren't just a trend, they were a real threat. But a threat to what exactly? Mainly to the unknown, I would say. The uncertainty that it poses in a way. Imagine you rule a country whose political issues are tough, and you see people covering their faces, not showing what they really do, and most importantly, organizing in groups. You might want to check that pretty quickly. According to what I read, there are some mandatory lectures in Russian schools where they discuss social issues that might be important to the political agenda. They were introduced before the quadrobing issue appeared, but it might have been brought along in order to raise awareness among the youth, mainly to reinforce values that the government might have seen as important. These lessons were about discouraging participation or painting it as something illegal, something that could ruin a young person's life, as something, politicians would say. They just aimed to reinforce what it was already known, that Russian laws prohibit masks at protests, but wearing a fursuit in a park or for social media content is not really restricted. However, since in Russia anything unfamiliar is often seen as a potential threat, misinformation obviously started spreading. They call these talks important conversations, as we were saying before, a term that sounds harmless but actually means ideological reinforcement. The goal of these chats to shape students' minds into thinking as the government wants them to think. Which, come on, that's the main reason why education is always a political act. The dominant part of society forces an agenda to the young using the indoctrination apparatus of the state, which basically is schools. Anyways, this is nothing new. But let's take a step back. Why is this such a big deal? It's not just about Quadrobers. The Russian government has been working hard to make sure young people stay in line. They've pushed for stricter educational policies, more control over the internet, and tighter surveillance on youth culture. The goal is to ensure that the next generation, which they clearly hate, grows up loyal, obedient, and uninterested in things that don't fit the government's ideas. And that brings us to the bigger question. Why is this happening now? One of the biggest theories is that this isn't actually about Quadrobers at all. It's about a distraction. That good old ex-Soviet technique to pretend things weren't actually real.
They should simply be told to keep their minds on their labor and leave matters of the state to the state. We seal off the city. No one leaves.
The Russian government is dealing with serious problems right now. The war in Ukraine is dragging on, the economy is struggling, and public dissatisfaction is growing at an alarming rate, something the government hasn't seen so present in the past. People are tired, people are frustrated, and they are looking for something, or anything, in fact, to direct their anger at. This is where the Quadrober controversy comes in. Instead of people focusing on real issues, they are being told to worry about something as harmless as teenagers wearing animal masks. It's a classic political strategy: create an enemy, manufacture outrage, and use it to shift attention from more important problems. Yet, if you read on, this furry drama was not even mentioned in parliament. That was how little it mattered to those in power. Once the story was clear, they just dealt with their agenda, which of course represents a political risk for furries in Russia, like laws against propaganda of non-traditional relationships. While not directly targeting furries, some content could be misinterpreted, and memes, of course, could be taken out of context. And this alleged banning only applied to large gatherings, which required official approval, but small meetups in cafes or parks, like furry meetups, are not restricted. But again, this seems a little odd for traditional Russians, like it happened with gods and emos. This destructive and disruptive behavior, as it was labeled, was a threat. Back in the day, they saw kids risking their sanity and their life even, and now they see kids on TikTok biting people and apparently eating dog food, which might be understood as something bad, something disruptive, something that could threaten the Russian common life. However, Russians used to include animals in their culture, so the question remains again as to whether this is Western influence or the evolution of a long-held tradition. The article from this newspaper called Deutsche Welle points out that in Soviet times, dressing as an animal was encouraged for children during celebrations, during, for example, Yolka, a celebration for New Year in Russia, typically associated also with Christmas, historically required that people would dress up in an animal costume. But today the same act is certainly a sign of rebellion, something that could potentially deviate traditional Russian society and even represent harmful activities for kids. The government seems to be in dire need to create regulations against these enemies who come to harm the Russian population. Yet, even if this behavior might be noisy on social media, the truth is that it doesn't represent a set of activities that are performed by a big number. In fact, if we compare the isolated cases of therian misconduct in public, in comparison to how kids actually play and the number of kids that are playing, they don't really exist on the whole. But apparently the best way to do away with something as disruptive as this activity is by creating a narrative about a group of people whose hobby represents a harmless minority and whose critics won't take the time to research, like it happened in the past with emos and goths. This is a powerful weapon, since these critics won't go deeper into analysis either because of laziness or because they don't care much about it. Of course, this will trigger off hate or discomfort, but what's curious is people's reactions as a whole.
Родители, когда ребенок рождается, затрачивают усилия для того, чтобы человек стал человеком, научился ходить, говорить, мыслить. А есть культура, которая человека возвращает обратно в животное, когда он начинает ходить в лото.
The most vocal critics of Quadrobers are often the same people pushing for harsher laws, stricter censorship, and more government control over the internet. However, some programs have taken the whole situation and have made revenue out of it, which, to my mind, is actually great.
Кошка.
Because it gives some sort of visibility to the whole community. Yet, pushing a problem under the rug is not a solution. Making fun of younger generation's hobbies will only add to the cringe and the uncomfort in the public eye.
Марьяна, можешь сразу, пожалуйста, всем ответить на вопросы, интересующие меня уж так точно? Ты тут у нас котенок или ты квадробер, не дай бог?
Which will eventually be the opposite reaction that furries actually want. Let's not forget that young people identify with this community, and the fact that the people with the means of communication take their power to mock around their identity or to diminish it will never help, even if they don't publicly attack furries. The more they convince people that youth culture is a threat, the easier it becomes to justify these crackdowns. And what these media provoke is not a reflection, it's just more harassment towards furries themselves, which, as a minority, they already have it quite difficult in a country as violent as Russia might be. So, after everything we've talked about, let's ask the big question. Are furries, or Quadrobers, actually a danger to Russian society? Or is this just another example of a government using fear to control the people? The reality is, young people have always found new ways to express themselves, and older generations have always been suspicious of it. Whether it was rock and roll, emo kids, or now furries, every generation faces moral panic over something that isn't actually a threat. But in Russia, yeah, this might go beyond generational differences. This is about control. If young people embrace self-expression and reject traditional values, they might become a little harder to manipulate. And if they stop believing in the government's propaganda, they might start questioning bigger things in the long run, like why their country is at war, or why their leaders are making life harder instead of actually making them better. In the end, this controversy says more about the Russian government's fears than it does about furries themselves. When a country is afraid of teenagers dressing as animals, you have to wonder, what are they really trying to hide?
That is how we keep the people from undermining the fruits of their own labor.
If you guys have enjoyed today's video, consider liking and subscribing. If you are from Russia and have more insight on this topic, feel free to share it down in the comments. I would love to read what you have to say. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take good care of yourselves, guys. Meow.
Вот это скрип, там